Good morning, kiddos. So today we are going to continue talking about the 1800s, but we're going to talk a little bit about how the society is changing, not just by the inventions that are taking place, but because of all of these new changes, increasing immigration. So the person at the time who was president of the United States didn't believe that the West was going to be populated for thousands of years. And one of the reasons is because when it first became part of the United States back in 1803, it was slowly being populated. It was pretty difficult to reach the other side of the Mississippi River that runs all along this way. And we didn't have all of these neat inventions that helped with transportation. But by 1824, 30% of Americans lived on the frontier. So yes, this part of the United States was more populated, but it was rapidly changing so that the West was also pretty populated as well. About 3 million people lived there. And one of these reasons was because of these new inventions, changes in transportation, and Americans wanting more land after the westward expansion. By 1836, from the 13 original states that we had, 13 colonies that became states when the United States became independent, by 1836, the United States had added 12 new states. So now there was a total of 25 states. So that's half of what we have now. Because of the addition of these states, the government changed to reflect all of these new people that were living here. And it also changed how people voted. So remember that in the beginning, it was only wealthy white male landowners who were allowed to vote. But now, because there's so many more people living in the United States and so many different kinds of people, more people were allowed to vote. Now you didn't have to own land, okay? And all men over the age of 21 were allowed to vote. So in 1828, about 1.2 million people voted, whether it was for legislators or for president, and that was a 200% increase from 4 years before. Another thing that was affected by all of this movement was that new political parties emerged. And one of these occurred because there was new needs for the common, regular people living in the United States. And during all this time, we're going to talk about Andrew Jackson, who was the president of the United States when all of these changes were happening. And I'll give you a little bit of background about him. He was born in the Carolinas, and he was pretty much like a common man. He was not very educated. He taught himself law, and he eventually became a judge. He came from a large family, and if you remember, he was one of the war heroes in the War of 1812. He was the one who led his group of soldiers in the Battle of New Orleans and defeated the British there. And because he was such a tough person, one soldier nicknamed him Old Hickory. And hickory is a type of wood, and it's really hard wood. So that name stuck to him because he was a very tough person and a very tough politician. So let's talk about him as president. Because he came from like a common family, had very little education, he was seen as a common man. And because of this, a lot of the common people, so just the regular majority of people that lived in the United States, voted for him. So he won the race, the presidential race, by a very large amount of votes. when he did his inauguration, so when he became the official president, um, there was thousands and thousands of people who gathered at the White House to listen to his speech. And this kind of showed that he was really liked by the people, by the common people of the United States. And because of this, he wasn't well liked by the rich, educated leaders in government. Um, Another reason was because when he was president, he would use his power, especially the power of the veto. Remember that presidents are allowed to veto or cancel a law before it becomes official. So he would use that veto a lot. And this kind of showed how much he controlled Congress and legislation, because Congress are trying to pass all of these laws, and once it would get to the president, he would veto or cancel them, and then they would have to go back and try to fix the laws to make them better and accepted. So his opponents grew really angry at him. They didn't like the fact that he was using his presidential power to cancel these laws that were trying to be put in place for the United States. And like I mentioned, the office of the president became more powerful. So he had a lot of power in deciding laws for the United States. And with this, people took sides for and against Jackson. So remember that we had a political party called the Democratic Republicans. Well, now that political party split into two different parties. So we had just the Democrats, and then we had the Republicans. And those who were seen as Democrats supported Jackson and all of his policies. But those who split into just the Republicans, who are also known as the Whigs, they opposed all of his policies. So let's talk a little bit about what kind of president he was and what kind of policies he put into place during his presidency. One of the mottos that he followed was protecting all and granting favors to none. So what this kind of means is that he wanted to protect the rights of the regular common people, especially those of farmers, settlers, the working people. And he didn't want to grant favors. He didn't just want to give things away to people who didn't really deserve it. Before he became president in 1816, there was the National Bank, and this is the Bank of the United States. So this bank gained control of the country's money supply. So all of the money that the government used was stored in this bank. Jackson didn't like the fact that only one bank had all of the United States money, so he decided to take all of the federal government's money from this bank and put it into the state and local banks. So he kind of distributed all of the federal government money into smaller banks. However, when he did this, the banks that had the federal money would make unwise investments and eventually lost the money. So let's say they would grant loans to people, but people were not able to pay them back, so that caused the money to be lost. So they couldn't get that money back. And this made the economy weak, and it happened in 1837. And this is one of the first great economic downturns of the United States. Something else that happened during Jackson's presidency was some trouble in South Carolina. In 1832, Congress passed a law on imported goods. So they would tax all goods that were shipped from the United States. So let's say New York made manufactured goods that were not available in, say, Virginia. So Virginia had to, or New York had to trade or ship these products to Virginia. So because it's all local in the United States, it's an imported good. But all of those goods now had a new tax on them, and all these items became very expensive. In the South, their economy relies mostly on agriculture. We talked about how in the South they have a lot of plantations and they have a lot of cash crops, so they don't have many products. In fact, they had to import a lot of products. Many people in the South were upset about this new tax, but in particular, the people of South Carolina were extremely upset. And they even threatened to leave the Union, to leave the United States. So South Carolina wanted to break away from the United States and they were going to become their own country, their own independent country. But Jackson decided to send troops and warships and all of this weaponry to South Carolina to collect all the taxes. Eventually, there was a compromise that was reached, but it kind of brought up the question of should states have the right to leave the Union if they don't agree with something that is happening in the federal government? Should they be allowed to leave and become independent? And eventually, that question is going to be answered when the Civil War happens, because the South is going to be upset with the North about the issue of slavery. There are more policies that we'll talk about, especially with the Native Americans that Andrew Jackson put into place. We'll talk about those things tomorrow, but for today's assignment, I just want you to quickly answer in your own words and your own opinion. If you were living in the 1800s with Jackson as your president, would you support his policies or would you oppose him? So are you on board with his strong policies, or is there something that you would change? So explain your choice in the 2 or 3 sentences. There's going to be a question attached to this assignment, so it might be 2 separate assignments, so just make sure that you answer the question on the social studies classwork tab. Okay, so we'll talk about the changes for natives tomorrow, and I'll see you later.